The croissant, cornerstone of the continental breakfast, symbol of France and driver of London inflation. Truly the king of pastries, or as they are called in French, viennoiserie, which means in the style of Vienna. Hang on, last time we checked, Vienna was not and never was in France. Although not for lack of trying. Today we'll tell you the true story behind the croissant. Then we'll make croissants together, following the oldest recipe in existence. The story you've probably heard, or were even taught at school, goes as follows. In 1683, during the Second Siege of Vienna, the Turks tried to collapse the walls of Vienna with tunnels, a common tactic in the age of pike and shot. However, the bakers, first to rise, suddenly noticed that their floors started speaking Turkish. They alerted the town guard, who were able to prevent the sappers from collapsing the walls. And so the bakers were lauded for saving the city, which they commemorated by creating a baked good in the shape of a crescent, a symbol of the vanquished Ottomans. Just under a century later, Marie Antoinette brought the moon-shaped pastry from Austria to France, where it became a huge hit. And the rest is history. It's a great story. It has war, working class heroes, and a tragic queen. It's so popular that, as we said, many were told this story in school. It was cited by great writers and was even quoted in Larousse Gastronomique, France's food dictionary. Although this last one sets the story in Budapest rather than Vienna, and some versions don't involve Marie Antoinette, while others name a specific Viennese baker, but many don't. Alright, this is getting complicated. Which one is correct? Well, none of them. But don't worry, the real story is plenty exciting. It involves soldiers, venture capitalism, fancy Parisian trends, and rapid technological innovation. And beer. There's some beer involved too. Our story does indeed start in Austria with a young army officer called August Zang, the son of an influential surgeon who dropped out of university and joined the Austrian army, where he, among other things, helped with the development of new weapons. In his late 20s, he inherited a large sum of money. Zang could have easily lived off this for the rest of his life, but being a man in his 20s, he decided to spend it on a snazzy coach and some fine horses, the 19th century equivalent of a sports car. He quickly learned that a snazzy coach did not buy you social capital among Vienna's high society, so he packed up and headed to Paris. France at the time was under the reign of Louis-Philippe, the Citizen King, so named because his support came from wealthy citizens like bankers, stockbrokers and lawyers, not the nobility. In other words, in Paris, people like Zang were in charge, and early capitalism was booming. And say what you want about Zang, the man had a knack for commerce. In 1838, although some say it was 1839, Zang opened Boulangerie Viennoise Zang, also known as Zang's Viennese Bakery, at 92 Rue de Richelieu. And upon opening, nobody came. Well, of course, he tried to sell foreign bread in France, the country you go to for bread. That might be the case now, but back when Zang moved to Paris, that wasn't true. Well into the 19th century, French bread was leavened with sourdough and consisted of just water, wheat and salt. In today's era of industry-produced bread, this is seen as pure and wholesome, but at the start of the Industrial Revolution, it was considered bland and boring compared to fluffier breads from places like Vienna. Even the English were turning up their noses at French bread. There are also vague sources hinting that Marie Antoinette had her cooks prepare white fluffy Kaisersemmeln, which must have been a welcome break from the everyday sourdough at the time. When making our earlier video on French bread, we also discovered that the first sugared brioches came from the German-speaking world. France might already have had a reputation for great food, but in the 19th century, when it came to bread, they were lagging behind. The place where bread was at the cutting edge of technology was Vienna, and Zang knew this. He traveled back to his native Vienna a number of times to learn about ovens, wheat, flour, and kneading machines, but above all, hire bakers. He never learned how to actually bake though. He was a businessman after all, not a baker. So by the time it opened, Zang's bakery was, compared to other Parisian bakers, high-tech. The use of beer yeast made his bread sweeter, the use of kneading machines made the crumb more uniform, and his dough was often enriched with things like eggs, butter and sugar. Lastly, the biggest innovation Zang brought with him was the steam-injected oven. Yes, Zang built himself an oven with a boiler that allowed for actual steam to be injected into the oven during baking. That's fancy even by today's standards. Later, these innovations would become known as the Vienna method, and today's bread would be different without them. Parisians in 1839 were not impressed. They were still French. However, Zang's bakery was fine because the first customers they had were not French, they were German. Much like today, Paris in the 19th century was a cosmopolitan city and home to a lot of Germans. Now, Germany wasn't a thing yet, so Germans here refers to Prussians, Austrians and everything in between. They loved the Zang bakery. Many worked for the Rothschild Bank, and every day Zang delivered a whole load of his goods there. In this box would be the pain viennoise, the main attraction of the bakery and, according to some, the precursor of the baguette, which sounds shocking, but actually makes sense if you know that, to this day, they look like this in France. However, this is quite contested. The pain viennoise was joined by sweet and savoury pretzels and various other Austrian specialties. Among them was a little treat in the shape of a horn. Although the French would later go on to refer to it as a little crescent, this was called a kipfel, which we are quickly going to make according to a recipe of the time. Zang prided himself on his machines, so you should use machines too if you have them. Take 140 grams of butter and cream it with 150 grams of sugar in your mixer. Then add in 50 grams of almond flour or grated almonds. Next, gradually add 170 grams of white flour. As this comes together, add some vanilla or vanilla extract. Now divide your dough into equal amounts, roll them into a sausage and then apply the signature crescent shape, or at least try as best you can. Bake at 180 degrees for 12 to 15 minutes, depending on how big you made them. When they come out, wait until they're cool enough to touch, else they'll crumble, and then roll them in some caster sugar. Now let cool down completely and eat. This is only one version of a kipfel. There were many other varieties, including savoury and yeasted ones. If you want to know more about these, go check out this video from Bake Across Europe. She also makes a different variety. The shape of the kipfel is also often attributed to a victory over the Ottomans, but this is folklore and not historic fact. What we do know is that rich people often have the ability to make something seem trendy and desirable. But that wasn't the only thing helping Zang's bakery take over Paris. Zang had another talent which would suit him well in the modern world. He was great at marketing. He would pay journalists to mention his bakery in completely unrelated articles. Frowned upon these days, but shrewd business back then. In addition, he marketed the breads in his bakery as untouched by human hands, made completely by machines and baked with steam. You see, back then, a highly industrialized process was seen as a desirable trait, in the way that artisanal is now. The more traditional Parisian bakers were, initially, not having any of it. They would pay chimney sweeps to visit Zang's bakery during its busiest times to try and scare his clientele away. However, Zang, ever the pragmatic businessman, solved this by simply paying them more. As time went on, the bakers of Paris stopped trying to boycott Zang and began to copy him. Capitalism at its finest. The word kipfel doesn't sit comfortable in the mouth for the French, who speak a language where the stress is almost always at the end of the word. So the French called them crescents or croissants. French bakers began baking Austrian specialties using finer flour, beer yeast and steam ovens. On the other hand, Zang and other Austrian-run bakeries that opened up in his wake started making their own interpretation of French classics. A perfect example of this, which we made in the past on this channel, is the brioche, which has been around for centuries but is considered a viennoiserie today. The pre-Zang brioche was a hard ball of enriched dough, whereas post-Zang it became the glazed sweet fluffy cake bread we know today. As time went on, more and more techniques were combined, and at one point somebody, most likely in Paris, decided to make a kipfel using one of France's culinary staples, puff pastry. Thanks to our good friend de la Varenne, we know that the French already had modern puff pastry in the middle of the 17th century. However, this was unleavened, most likely because the sourdough used in France was not strong enough to leaven this rich dough. In addition, the sour taste probably didn't work very well here either. But then, as part of the Vienna process, Auguste Zang brought something important to Paris. The Austrians had perfected the technique of using bee yeast for bread making. The yeast no longer had the traditional beery flavour of medieval yeast. It was durable and very strong. Strong enough to leaven puff pastry. We didn't get to the croissant that quickly though. The journey actually went rather slowly and nobody really knows why. There are plenty of French croissant recipes, but as we've explained, these are all more yeasted kipfel rebrands, which didn't use puff pastry. Probably very nice, but not what we're looking for. One of the first recipes using puff pastry and rich yeasted dough can be found in B.T. Pownall's book The Queen of Cookery Books, which was published in London in 1902. Would that mean that the modern croissant is English? No. It's a good recipe, but it uses rough puff pastry rather than the proper French lamination technique. According to the Institute for Culinary Education in New York, the first laminated croissant recipe was written by Sylvain Claudius Guy, a French baker who worked in America, in his 1915 book Cuisine Anglo-Américaine. So, is there an American element to the modern croissant? Should we start pronouncing it croissant? No. The Institute for Culinary Education is wrong. No, the first recipe using lamination, and the one we'll be using, comes from another Auguste, not Zang, but Colombi, who published a recipe for croissant au boulanger in his Nouvelle Encyclopédie Culinaire in 1906. In this book, we find what we think is the earliest recipe for a modern croissant. It reads like a modern recipe, so that's a good start. Here we go. We're going to make our levain first, also known as a sponge or pouliche. Take 125 grams of your flour, add 100 grams of warm milk to it and mix. In the stand mixer, remember, no human hands and all that. Now, add 10 grams of fresh yeast to this. You can use active dry, but fresh is much better and more authentic, as this would have been used in 1906. Wait for this to double in size. Should be about half an hour. Take 375 grams of flour, 10 grams of salt, 1 egg yolk and 250 grams of room temperature milk and mix this all into your stand mixer before adding in the levain and let it knead for 10 minutes. This is our détrempe, a leavened dough. Let this rest for 1 to 2 hours. The recipe tells us to let it go for 3 to 4 hours, but we think that either the yeast back then wasn't as strong or the temperature lower, because that just gave an overproofed mess. So we concluded that 2 hours is more than enough. While this rises, we're going to get out our beurrage or butter. The recipe tells us to put the butter in the middle of the dough. This is where the modern baker will be completely baffled when you realize that this recipe dates from a time when refrigeration was basically space tech. So there's no need to make one of those butter squares, as the butter would have been soft anyway. There's a maxim in French baking that goes, if the dough is soft, the butter should be soft. If the dough is tough, the butter should be tough. As our dough is rather soft because of its high hydration, you can just let the butter get to room temperature. When your dough has rested for 2 hours, roll it nice and flat and shape it into roughly a 40 by 20 centimeter rectangle. Modern recipes will have you measure this out, but the 1906 recipe doesn't require this, so you can sort of wing it. Now spread your butter in the middle and fold shut, and give it 2 folds. The odds of this stirring are not 0, and if it does, don't panic. This recipe is weirdly forgiving. Let it rest for half an hour. Take out your dough after half an hour and give it another 2 folds, resulting in our final sheet. Today's recipes will tell you to gingerly cut this sheet into triangles and treat the dough very carefully. Not so at the start of the 20th century. No, we're told to divide the dough into 24 pieces and then roll these pieces into balls. Wait, all that layering and now balls? This can't be right. If we check the 1915 Guy recipe, he tells us to cut them up in squares of 4 by 5 centimeters. Okay, this looks more like it. Don't tell us the ICE was right after all. Oh no, Guy also tells us to ball it up. Guess that's just how they did it back then. After balling them up, we're told to roll them out, not in triangles but in diamonds or rhombi. Roll them up like this and let them rest for another hour. Meanwhile, preheat your oven to 200 degrees Celsius. Now glaze them with some egg yolk and milk and pop them in the oven with plenty of ice cubes. This is viennoiserie, it needs to be steamy in there. After 15 to 20 minutes you should have these nice little croissants. And they don't look like croissants, really, inside or outside, although some do show the typical spiral. That's just how they were though. We made these a few times and with some practice we might have gotten them more uniform and neat, but they would still mostly look like this. The Association of French Bakers states that the croissant only started taking over in the 1920s, and a 1933 book by Félix Urbain Dubois, which was considered the standard for French baking at the time, lists multiple types of croissants. There is the croissant ordinaire, which looks like a buttery kipferl. There is the semi-feuilleté, which sort of resembles these, but at the end he lists croissant feuilleté, or puff pastry croissant. This one begins to resemble the recipes we know today. Unlike the others, this recipe instructs us to let the dough rest in the cold for 10 hours. It explains that the butter will be hard in winter, but that in summer it must be chilled regularly. Therefore, it is generally accepted that the croissant as we know and love today only came about in the 1930s. Which makes sense, as that's when refrigeration reached the levels of reliability we are used to today. If you want us to make a video in which we make a present-day croissant, leave us a comment telling us to do so, and we'll see to it. Oh, and while you're there, why don't you like and subscribe too? Back to our pre-refrigeration croissant. Our little proto-croissants have now cooled down and we can finally dig in. They are, as expected, not as flaky and crispy as modern croissants, but they do have that typical buttery taste of croissants. All in all, they're not bad. Less of a mess when eating too. Can we now answer the question, are they French or Austrian? Royal viewers will know that we have a bit of a hang-up about putting flags on dishes. It's quite common these days on the internet to lure people in with a bold, the thing associated with country A is not actually from country A. We ourselves are quite guilty of this. But our view on this has always been that it's a bit silly to try and plant flags on foods, as almost everything is a product of various influences. There are probably a few out there, but we can't think of any dish or technique that emerged entirely within the borders of one nation state, itself a 19th century invention. Is paella Spanish? Yes, but they had to get the rice from China and the saffron from Iran first. British fish and chips? The potato had to come from America and the battering technique from Jewish Portuguese immigrants. We here believe that if you do want to associate a certain food with a country, it's the culture that formed around it that counts, not the actual point of invention. The croissant is a staple of French culture. You can get stellar croissants in boulangeries on corners of practically any Parisian street, whereas the best croissants in Vienna are in French-style bakeries. Hence, the culture of the croissant is undeniably French, and the modern croissant was developed in the heart of Paris. That doesn't mean that Austria doesn't deserve credit though. If not for the Vienna method, we would not have our favorite breakfast item. We like to think of it like this. The croissant and all other viennoiserie are French crops grown from Austrian seeds. And where is August Zang in all of this? Did he ever declare the croissant his invention? No. After just under 10 years in Paris, He packed up and left, even before the first hybrid recipes were surfacing. He went on to publish a French-style newspaper in Austria, and then became a mine owner and died in 1888. Almost 2 decades before the codification of the croissant. Too bad he never got to taste these croissants. They're quite nice, really. Come to think of it, Zang inherited a ton of money, moved to a hub of free market thinking, disrupted the market and then left to invest his money on media. Hang on, we just realized it. Well, there you have it. The croissant came to be thanks to the 19th century equivalent of a tech bro. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to know how puff pastry came to France, click here. Bye.